Welcome to the Boyk Brief. The Boyk Brief invites you to go into chambers with the attorneys of Boyk Law as we explore real legal cases, talk to fascinating people in our area, raise awareness about community initiatives, and share helpful information about protecting yourself and those you love.
I'm very happy today to have with us one of the deans of the Toledo Bar, Criminal Defense Bar, the past president of the Toledo Bar Association, and probably the best liked attorney that I've ever met in my life, Pete Rost. Pete, thanks for being with us today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Okay. So, Pete, you've been practicing for how many years now?
I passed the bar in 1977. November, I was licensed.
Why don't you tell us the story about where you grew up, your family, and how you ended up going to law school?
Sure. I'm from Toledo originally. My mom's from Chicago Heights, Illinois. Met my father, who's actually from Defiance, Ohio, or was. They met when he was in medical school at Loyola, Chicago, and she was in pharmacy school in Chicago. He did his residency here in Toledo. He was an OB/GYN, and he stayed in town. They made their home here, had 5 children. I'm number 2 of the 5. And been here ever since, obviously. I moved away for a couple of years after college to work and then came back here. Went to St. Agnes Grade School in West Toledo. Went to Central Catholic High School. There are 5 kids in our family. We went to 4 different high schools, which shows you how close we are. I went to Central, followed by University of Toledo. Got a degree in math and taught school for 2 years, and then decided that although it was a great job, excuse me, it was something I didn't see financially being as rewarding as it was personally rewarding. So I decided to try law school. Took the test, got in, and went to law school and graduated in 1977. June, took the July bar, licensed in November, and have been practicing law ever since.
So I'm assuming when you were growing up as a little kid, spending your life practicing criminal law wasn't what you were thinking about.
If you would ask the nuns from grade school, I was probably close to criminal law, but on the other side of the table, not just the lawyer. No, not at all. I come from a very science, medical background family. As I said, my father is a physician. My mother is or was a pharmacist. I have 2 brothers who are doctors, an older sister who was an RN, and myself and a younger sister who has done clerical work and secretarial work during her working career. So no, law school, nobody else in my family was a lawyer. Most of them are either doctors or various jobs and professions, an engineer, that type of thing. But uncles and aunts. And my mom's side of the family, they own the typical Greek immigrant story. They came from Greece, came here without speaking the language. They opened up a little store in Chicago Heights. They had a lunch counter, an ice cream counter, a liquor store, supported their 5 children with that. And I was there often during the summer times, especially my later years at grade school and high school. It was a great experience. So no lawyers anywhere.
So when you went to law school, was there some great love of criminal law that resulted in you ending up there, or what's the story?
Well, I went to law school because I thought it would be interesting to figure out problems and answer problems. And quite frankly, I learned that some of my instinct in the beginning was it's a lot like social work. And I think it really is, especially the criminal law aspect. So when I was in law school, I clerked originally for Jack Lenovit, who at that time was doing primarily personal injury and medical malpractice cases. And I did research and writing for Jack, and that's how I met Robert Kaplan and John Richardson, who I've been associated with since law school, essentially. Jack Lenovit was in their office, in our office at the time. So I was exposed to the injury work through Jack Lenovit, and because of Bobby Kaplan and John Richardson, I was exposed to the criminal law defense. And when I first got out, I got great advice from Bobby Kaplan, and that was, you ought to learn how to do something at least one time for almost every area of the law. You never know when a relative or a neighbor or a good friend needs help. You should do it. And I followed that advice and just kind of morphed into just plaintiff's personal injury work and criminal defense. And that's how I got here.
So your first years, were you mostly doing criminal defense, or how did you get from the beginning to where you're at now?
Well, I followed Bobby's advice, and I did a little bit of everything. Any piece of case that came into the office, we weren't partners or anything. In fact, they called me Rumpelstiltskin for a while. They would give me this problem, and I would try to turn it into a success for the client and a fee for myself. So I did some wills, I did some domestic work, did a little bit of probate work. The only area of the law I never dabbled in at all was bankruptcy, and that's because back then all the forms you had to file had to be done by hand or by typewriter. We didn't have the computers that we have now or anything. And I took one look at the packet of forms, and I decided no matter who has to get help for that, I'm not the person to help them. So I didn't do that. But then as your practice grows, you tend to specialize. And so I got rid of the domestic work as fast as I could. I liked the trial work, be it injury or criminal defense. And I did a lot of injury for a long time, and probably 60% criminal and 40% plaintiff's work. And in the end, I just decided to stick with the criminal. So I'll do an injury case here and there, but primarily criminal defense has been this way for probably 15 or 20 years now.
So one of the things that's interesting about you is your style. I mean, you're obviously an excellent trial attorney, but I think your reputation is basically common sense and getting things done fast. And I mean, I've always noticed that like your likability and trustworthiness gets you almost everywhere with everybody.
I think that it's nice of you to notice that and to say that about me, but I learned early on that you get a lot further being nice to people than you do screaming and yelling and pounding it on the table. It doesn't seem to work very well. At least it doesn't fit my personality very well. There is a time to yell and scream, but you have to do it for a purpose. To get angry and upset and yell and scream doesn't accomplish much for you or your client. So it just doesn't come natural to me to begin with. And I think a lot of what we do as lawyers in general, and certainly criminal lawyers, a lot of what we do is social work. Most of the people that I represent in criminal courts, they're not bad people. They may have done something that's bad or something that's illegal, but most of them are just normal people who have gotten themselves in a fix. And they're looking for a way to get out of the system. And so you have to represent them in a fashion and in a form that makes everyone comfortable with what you're trying to do, including the client, obviously, in the state who's on the other side, to convince the state that they should treat this person with the respect that they do and to get them out of the system as well. I mean, everyone benefits when nobody's in the system. And so I've just found it to be easier that way. It helps that in the Toledo area, we have we're known, the lawyers in Toledo, as having the Toledo way. We're very much more congenial here in Toledo than some of the other bar associations in other cities. And I've practiced in courts in other cities, and it's very competitive in a harsh way. We're competitive here in Toledo, but we're competitive and polite at the same time. And I think that that just fits my style better, if I have a style at all. So that's how I end up doing what I do, I guess.
I guess one of the things that impresses me about you is you'll have extremely serious cases, and your biggest fan or best buddy might be your opponent. And I think I've noticed over the years that you've always impressed me like Norma Cheers, meaning when you walk into the courtroom, the judge, the prosecutor. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago, I was in a courtroom and you shook hands with basically every attorney, hugged the prosecutor, The judge shook hands with you. It was almost like
Yeah.
almost like a celebrity was coming into the courtroom.
And then I'm sure they beat me like they should have to begin with, if that was the case. It is, well, first of all, I like lawyers. I really do. And I think our profession serves a very valuable purpose, not only for the clients, but for the community in general. And we hear that voiced a lot. Really understanding it took a number of years of practice before you appreciate how true that really is. So I do respect counsel and opposing counsel. And again, we can argue and fight over a case and what it means, but you reach people by reaching out for their intelligence. No one's scared of me. And I'm not going to scare someone to death to give me something for my client that they don't deserve. But hopefully you can appeal to their intelligence and their civility to see that good part of the case from my view and give our client or my client what he deserves and to treat him properly. And that's true with judges and lawyers. Sometimes I hear a lawyer say, I've got this prosecutor. He's very difficult to deal with, or she's really hard to deal with. It doesn't make any difference. All you want is somebody smart to deal with. Whether they're easier or harder or having a good day or a bad day, in the end, probably doesn't make much difference. It's whether they're smart or not. So, and that's true with judges. Some judges have reputations of being harsher than others. Some have reputation of being more patient than other judges. In the end, you want the judge to listen, reach their intelligence, and make a decision that's fair. That's what they're supposed to do. And I think that happens most of the time.
So your reputation has happened as a result of a bunch of large cases, but I don't think the average person on the street understands that a large amount of your practice might be drunk driving cases, driving under suspensions. I mean, the whole gambit as a criminal defense attorney. And I've seen like a lot of attorneys say you're basically like the mayor of Toledo Municipal Court, that, you get along with the common person.
I feel I do, and I try to, and I like my clients for the most part. They're people who have just gotten themselves in a jam most of the time. There's some people who do some very serious things that are terrible, but that's not the everyday practice. And yes, I'm in municipal court a lot. Every municipal court, in my experience of 40 some years that I've been doing this, has a different system. Toledo's is relatively unique. And for whatever reason, if you practice in Toledo Municipal Court on a regular basis, and the clerks know you and the bailiffs know you and the judges trust you because you're candid and honest, the prosecutors trust you, the police officers are very helpful to the defense lawyers when they know they can trust you, and you can move cases through there without too much difficulty, without too much damage to your client. They can be held accountable, but municipal courts are there essentially to help people. And I think we see that now more than ever. Clients or people who have gone to court for license issues for their driver's license, judges are more interested in getting them valid than they are punishing them for driving without a license for the most part. DUIs and domestic violences are different. They're serious, obviously, but the idea is there to help people to get back on their feet again. And yeah, I like municipal court a lot. It's easy.
You've handled quite a few murder cases. I know a lot of them privately retained, and I know a lot of times when you get a really difficult case, when the judge knows they need somebody really good, you get appointed, probably personally called by the judge to represent those people. About how many murder cases have you handled in your career?
When we were discussing that before we started this question and answer conversation, I tried to think of it. I've never really counted them. I know at one time I represented about a little more than a dozen capital cases. Simple murder cases, by that I mean non-death penalty cases. I have no idea. I know I have 6 or 7 going right now of different homicides that are pending presently. 2 of them with John Richardson, the other 4 or 5 are on my own. John and I have paired up on a couple of them. So I have been called in the past because of my experience, I suppose, and longevity, and hopefully my skill. that a judge will call and say, look, this is a particularly difficult case, or this is a difficult client for some reason. We'd like someone experienced to either do it myself or to co-counsel with a younger lawyer, someone maybe less experienced, which I've done a number of times, and I find that to be not only helpful but interesting as well. It's nice to be able to mentor somebody. So yeah, I've done that. I don't know how many. I really have no idea.
So anybody that does criminal defense, if they're at a party, is always asked the question, how do you represent those type of people? How do you sleep at night? And for somebody like you who gets a lot of the more serious and heinous type of crimes, I'm sure you've heard that question before.
I have. And the answer, I know, can sometimes sound simplistic when it's not. We don't represent what our client is accused of doing. We represent the client to make sure that whatever the state is trying to do to the client by way of convicting that person, him or her, for a felony or a serious offense, that they do it within the bounds of fairness as dictated by our laws. So my client can be accused of doing something that's horrible, that everyone would agree is horrible. And you can prosecute that person, but you have to do it the right way. And that's what defense attorneys assure of. In the play A Man for All Seasons, there's a dialogue between two characters, Thomas More and I think his son or son-in-law. And the son-in-law questioning why More won't just do what has to be done to accomplish what's there, forget what the law says. And More tells him, the law protects everyone. I can't quote it word for word, but if you cut down every law in the land, what's going to protect you when you turn around and now it's your turn to be protected? There's no trees left standing, the trees being the law. You cut down every law in the land and you're standing there at the whim and will of people who have power. And so that really, I don't usually give that long of an explanation, but you represent the person in their rights, not what they did. I don't stand for people who do violent crimes. Sometimes it happens and sometimes it's ugly, but the Constitution doesn't say only good people and wrongly accused people get a lawyer. So all my clients in the beginning think they're wrongly accused and misunderstood. That's how we start. So
I wanted to talk specifics, a couple of your more famous cases. In 2014, the fireman case where the firemen were killed in the arson fire. Could you give a little bit of background on that?
I can make a few comments about the case and what part was interesting from a legal perspective. The owner of the building that caught on fire during the response by the Toledo Fire Department, things got out of hand and two firemen were killed while fighting the fire. And my client was charged initially as a capital case. Eventually, we convinced the state that probably wasn't, there wasn't a basis to proceed on the capital case. And eventually, during the pretrial proceedings, they withdrew the capital punishment aspect of the case. The interesting part about that case was the science of how a fire starts and what happens to it based on what the construction of the building is. And in that case, the state had indicated in their responsive pleadings that my client's intention was to cause the death of firemen, which made it more difficult as the case went on to prove, because my client didn't know who the fire department was, no matter whether he was involved in the fire and to what extent. It also was one of the cases where if I can recall, the first time, not the first, but one of the very first, where the county relied upon security cameras from a number of different commercial establishments to track movements of people of interest, including my client, from before the fire and after the fire, and security cameras from not only the premise that was on fire, but other locations. They did telephone tapping, so to speak, to find locations, not necessarily conversations, in order to put their case together. And that science aspect of it was interesting. In the end, in the middle of I think it was a 3-week trial, the third week, in the middle of the third week, there was something that happened in court that caused the court to declare a mistrial which gave added incentive to both the defense and the state to try to reach an agreement to resolve the case without having to do the trial all over again with a new jury. And we were able to do that. There was a plea entered, and the defendant entered a plea and agreed to a 20-year sentence, which is about half served at this point, I believe. Close to it, anyhow.
Another case that has gotten a lot of publicity and a lot of comments in the community, the Cook brothers. That was probably one of the more serious, cases in the last 50 or 100 years in Toledo. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
I can give you a review of what the case was about. I represented Nathaniel Cook. The two brothers were defendants, Nathaniel and Anthony. By the time this involved a number of different homicides that occurred about 40 years ago now. And about 20 years later, with DNA and some other newly developed or better developed scientific evidence, they reopened the case and charged both Anthony Cook, who was not my client, but who was already doing time for a murder that he was convicted of at trial earlier, a number of years before, and they included in the indictment allegations against Nathaniel. A lot of pretrial fighting about DNA. I remember that during the course of that, we convinced the judge. I did that case with Bobby Kaplan, and we convinced the judge that we needed to hire a DNA expert, not just rely upon the expert that the state was using, which back at that time was through the medical college. So I got to get in touch with and became friends with a gentleman named Robert Shaler out of New York City, who was very instrumental in advancing this whole theory of DNA and how it can be used in evidence. He was the chief science person for the Manhattan prosecutor's coroner's office. And yet he agreed to not only meet with me a number of times, but to testify if necessary in the Cook trial and on Nathaniel's behalf. And I was able to reach out to him again at a later time to help with a case that was a couple of years ago. And although he retired from the coroner's office, he is still doing work in his own lab. He was the main, this is how qualified he was the main person in the 9/11 catastrophes in New York City. He was the primary person identifying victims of that attack by DNA of all the evidence. So I think he agreed to testify in two cases that I'm aware of. The Cook case on behalf of Nathaniel Cook, and I believe he was instrumental in assisting in some ways the defense in the O.J. Simpson trial. So the DNA has become much more frequently used by the prosecutor in cases. The Cook trial was 20 years ago, so it was not as sophisticated then as it was now. So that was one. In Nathaniel Cook, he did too complicated to go through now, but he is out on probation and doing fine. He did about 20 years, and that was part of the resolution 40 years ago, about 21 and a half years ago. He did his 20 and he's out. So
one more specific case I wanted to talk about, the Robert Bowman case. That was a pretty infamous case that I think you ended up dealing with twice.
Yes.
Go into that.
Well, back in 1968, a young lady, I think she was a freshman or sophomore student at Central High School, disappeared toward Thanksgiving time or so. A few months later, her body was found, and the case remained unsolved for many, many years. And then probably 9 or 10 years ago, 8 years ago, this case is, they indicted Robert Bowman based on DNA evidence that they uncovered with the new techniques that are used. And they were able to put enough evidence together to get an indictment from the grand jury. That case was tried for a week or two. The first trial ended up in a hung jury. I think it was 10-2 for guilty or something of that nature. 2 or 3 months later, we had to try it again. It's always hard to try a case a second time whatever persuasion and arguments you make in the first trial, now the prosecutor knows what they are so they can better prepare. Same is true for the defense, but we're usually at the short end of a case when it's at the trial anyhow. So it's been said that defense lawyers, we wake up behind the 8 ball every day. So there is a presumption of innocence, but I'm not sure that applies except until you get to the trial part. So we tried it a second time. Mr. Bowman was convicted that time. And although it started out as a capital case back in 1968 or whenever they indicted it, it had been, the Ohio statute for capital punishment had been voided a couple of times by the U.S. Supreme Court. And the action of when they brought this fit in one of those time periods, so the death penalty was not available to the state. He was sentenced to essentially life in prison after the conviction. That case was interesting for two things. The DNA, much more current than it was 20 years ago with the Cook's case, the science of DNA. That was interesting to learn and to deal with. And in that case, a family member of the decedent, obviously now an adult, made a victim impact statement. And I'm sure people who listen to this may hear about Marcy's Law and the victims have a right to make statements in court. That was one of the best things I've ever heard said in a court of law, this victim's impact statement. It was heartfelt, it was objective, it was so moving that at the end of the case, I usually try to talk to the family of the other side, if nothing else, to tell them of my sympathies and give them my sympathies. And I asked her for a copy of it, and she was kind enough a week or so later to give me a copy of the statement, which I shared with my kids because it's never bad to have somebody read a very concise, intelligent, moving piece of literature, no matter what the context it was prepared in. So I made copies and sent them to, at that time, my two older kids. The third child was too young, but I gave it to them afterwards. So they all read it, so they knew what it was about. That was an interesting case, extremely sad for everybody, especially the victim's family.
You've had the opportunity to work with some of the biggest named and most impressive attorneys in the last 50 years. I know in the legal community, Bobby Kaplan is a legend. Maybe you could just briefly talk about Bobby's influence in the legal community and on your life.
Sure. Yeah, Robert Kaplan is a treasure. He is perhaps one of the 2 or 3 smartest people I've ever met. Extremely talented lawyer, extremely busy, and taught me how important it was to do a good job for your client, forget all the other aspects of the profession about what kind of office are you in, how much money do you make. That if you're interested in that, then you shouldn't practice law in Bobby's office. Although we were never practiced as partners, he taught me a whole lot about the law and about how to treat people. And I know that Bobby's reputation is huge, and I'm sure some of that reputation is he could be quite ornery and forceful. And I'll tell you a great story in a second, but he taught me that you don't get mad unless it serves a purpose, because if all you do is act out of anger, you're not doing anybody any good, and you're going to be less effective than you would be otherwise. So he taught me how to practice law. He taught me how to treat people, which was like almost a graduate course, because my parents didn't do such a bad at that either, or my grandparents. But Bobby was extremely influential. And at that time, the office consisted of Jack Lenovit, who I mentioned before, John Richardson, who's still practicing now. He told me to tell you he loves you when I told him I was coming out here. And there's Fritz Byers is in the office now. I say our office, but we're all independent. Brian Vicent, who does what you do, primarily personal injury work. And Bobby's been a huge, huge influence, as much as in almost more than anybody but my father. He just tremendous person. John Richardson, of course, he who moves at the speed of light. so you're not able to talk to him. I think I practiced in the office for 20 years before I could actually sit down and talk to him. Other than that, I was chasing his tails all over municipal court. And same with Jack Lenovit. He's been very nice. Dick Walensky, who is one of the premier lawyers in the city, certainly in the state, and probably country. And I've learned a lot from Richard about the law and evidence. And I'm not allowed to talk to him. As Bobby told me in the beginning, you're allowed to ask Richard a question, but not till you do all the research and think it through yourself. Then you can ask him, but you can't take more than 5 minutes of his time. So there's been a number of people that have been influential. Those people I've practiced with for essentially 40 some years now.
John Richardson, I remember as a young attorney, whenever he would give a sentencing speech and I was just in a courtroom, and I always would just sit down and listen and take notes.
Absolutely.
The thing about Richardson is, like, I've never saw him actually like carry a briefcase or do anything. He seems to do everything just off the top of his head. Like, he doesn't need notes or anything like that.
Well, he's obviously very prepared because you see how he is in court. John has a gift of language that is bar none to uppermost and topmost. Whenever anybody in our office needs some introduction somewhere, you didn't do a bad job, Chuck, but if I had my druthers, Richardson would be here, because after he talks, I might as well just sit down and not say anything. I learned early on when we had cases where we had co-defendants, I learned always to make my statement first, or certainly before John did. Because once John talks, I don't know what I'm going to say and how I'm going to say it. And whatever I say, John can say it better and more persuasively. So if I say it first and then he speaks, they only listen to they remember what he said, not so much what I say. But you're right, he does have a wonderful gift. And that's why he is called upon oftentimes, not just on behalf of his clients, but he's very much involved in like the Jazz Society programs at the University of Toledo that he's been involved in for speakers across the years. When I was sworn in as president of the Bar Association, I asked him to do the introduction, and he kindly did so. He has a gift. There's no question about it.
You also had the opportunity early in his career to mentor Judge Jeff Helmick. Maybe you could talk a little about Jeff.
Sure. Bobby Kaplan is Jeff's uncle. Jeff's mother is Bobby's sister-in-law. And so Jeff was with one of the more established firms in town when he became a lawyer. And Bobby mentored him personally and professionally, like he has to those people he takes under his wings. And Jeff joined our firm. So again, independent offices, but joined our offices. And Jeff got the same treatment from Bobby that we all got, which is a graduate course on how to be a lawyer. So Jeff had to learn that you can't carry a briefcase to municipal court. It's not needed. You don't need a fountain pen. Any old ballpoint pen will do, because you're going to lose it anyhow. It doesn't matter how you dress or anything else. That's not what's important. And I was charged with, at that time, doing a few trials with Jeff. And of course, Jeff took all the good parts of what Bobby said, ignored all the parts that are only Bobby or only my habits, and he created his own persona and habit, and now he's a federal judge. So, and he left our office. He decided that he wanted to do things a little bit differently, and he decided to do some stuff on his own. And he practiced and ends up on the federal bench. So I remind him whenever I have a case in federal court that if he doesn't treat me correctly, I'm calling his mother. Because I still have her phone number. I don't think it scares him anymore, but it scares the prosecutor more than it does him. I was also, Sam Kaplan's in the office. I neglected to mention Sam before. And when Sam first started, Bobby again charged me with, okay, you'll try a couple cases with Sam to teach him how it works. And he didn't need much teaching, but I was able to do that too. And now Sam helps me more than I help him, I'm sure.
You recently were the president of the Toledo Bar Association. What did you learn, and why did you decide to do that?
Well, first of all, it's a really, really nice honor from the people I practice law with and are members of the Bar Association. When I started practicing 40 some years ago, everybody joined the bar. And I understand now, being involved in the leadership of the bar, that's true everywhere. Doctors joined academies of medicine, teachers joined whatever groups they had. Not so true in the last 7 or 8 years. I think social media has made it so the younger people don't join as readily the professional associations that us older people did as a matter of course when we first started in the profession. So I joined like I was told to join. You know, you're a lawyer now, you took the oath, join the Bar Association, which I did. And I was involved, not overly time-wise, but I was on a committee here and there, and I learned from a lot of older lawyers, more experienced than I am, just by sitting there listening at some of the committee meetings about different areas of the law. And I met a lot of people in the Bar Association and in the profession that I would never have known anyhow. I haven't done a domestic case, for example, in 30 years. If I go to domestic court to help a client on a related matter that's related to a criminal case, you can't believe how many people are so nice to say, here, how you doing? We don't see you. What are you doing here? Here's how you do this. No, here's this form. Go to this person. Because I don't go to that court, so I don't really know. But the Bar Association was instrumental in getting me familiar with other people in the bar and familiarizing them to me. So a number of years ago, I was asked to run for the board of directors. I honestly and humbly said, sure, I'll do that. It sounds interesting. I'm not much for boards particularly, and that's the first one I ever served on. And I was fortunate enough to get elected. And then the structure of the Bar Association back then was you could do 3 years, two terms. And during the second term, I was asked to run for the third vice presidency, which back then was a contested position. And I first said no. I didn't think that was something I really would be good at. I was called again a couple of times that same year, and finally Jim Yavorsic talked me into it. So I said, okay. Now I honestly and humbly expected I would just lose, and so then I would serve my last year on the board and be done with that commitment. Well, I was fortunate, certainly in hindsight, to be successful, and so 3 years as a vice president, and then last year as the president. And this is my last year on the board as past president, so I'm done in end of June. A fabulous, fabulous experience. I'm not sure how well I was the leader, but we have a lot of lawyers in town who work extremely hard to provide better access to the services that lawyers provide, to protect the public, to make sure that everyone's doing things the right way, to continue with education. It's a well-worthy organization led by some tremendous people. The staff at the bar, which is about 7 or 8, maybe 9 people, including the executive director, who's now Brad Lagouche. They take care of the profession in Toledo, and they make sure that we work hand in hand with the other bar associations in the city and across the country so that we can provide the services clients expect to have. It's a great experience. I would not have traded it at all. I didn't realize it at the time, but it's one of the highlights of being a lawyer. It's been very nice.
One thing we haven't talked about yet, your wife, Barb, is a well-respected civil lawyer. Why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about Barb, your kids, and all your grandchildren that I'm sure you're very proud of?
Yeah, that's easy. Barb is, she goes by her maiden name, Barbara Stutz. She informed me right away that she was not taking my name. It took me a year to get her to say yes to marry me. So she is an attorney. She practiced, well, first of all, she was Mel Resnick's criminal bailiff, which is how I actually met her. She's a couple years younger than I am. She got out of law school. She worked for Jim Millen for a while in a small office in Maumee. She joined what was Fuller and Henry at the time. And then after that, while at Fuller and Henry, she did a lot of work for Owens, Illinois in the asbestos defense area. And then Barb, along with Bob Bunda and Teresa DeWitt, left the Fuller office and started their own office, and were able to take the OI asbestos business with them for the most part. So for quite a while now, for probably 20 years or so, last 20, 25 years, Barb was the Owens, Illinois case manager, for lack of a better term, over the East Coast asbestos defense work. So even though she wasn't employed at OI as an employee, Owens, Illinois was their main client. And so she traveled a lot to the East Coast, Boston, New York, Providence, Rhode Island, that area. OI, a year and a half ago now, finally spun off their asbestos business, which I think terminated in the mid-50s. And they made a separate entity, and they filed bankruptcy January of last year. And that effectively ended the litigation, which worked out well for Barb because she was cutting back anyhow. And it wasn't forced retirement, but it was a good time for her to retire. She's still very active in the Bar Association on a number of things. She still helps out here and there on a case, but she's enjoying her free time. So that's what she's doing. We have 3 kids. My oldest son is Justin. He's a lawyer in Panama City. He just won a week-long jury trial of 4 days yesterday. He does insurance defense work, Chuck. You would get along with him well. He told me that the offer to settle was $35,000 on his recent case, and the jury came back with $3,200.
Wow.
So he's married to a woman, Shopa Reddy, who's a doctor. They have 2 kids, Rohan and Aaliyah, ages 12 and 10 this year. He went to undergrad at U of M, Michigan. He went to law school at University of Miami in Florida. They lived in Florida for a while. They moved to Kentucky while she was doing her fellowship. She's a gastroenterologist. And they ended up in Panama City, where her dad has practice in the same area of medicine that she is in. So I'll tell you a real quick story about this that young lawyers might appreciate. And I've told this before at gatherings at the Bar Association. My son worked for the Miami-Dade public defender when he got out of school down in Florida, because he knew he was going to move shortly to the Jacksonville area where his wife was going to do part of her training. When he moved up to Jacksonville, he applied at a bunch of small firms for employment and wasn't having any luck. And I told him this one firm, I said, you ought to at least write him a letter, not just an email and everything, thank him for the interview. And he did so. And he got a call about 4 days after they got the letter and said, you're hired. Nobody's ever sent us a letter before. And he practiced there for 2 years and then went to Louisville and then to Panama City. And it was a small firm that hired him, doing a lot of plaintiff's work and car dealership stuff of some kind of business. Well, the head of the firm, who's about my age, called my son and said, hey, we want to send you a case down in Panama City. And how are you doing and everything else? He had stayed in touch. And he said, it's okay, but I'm not really thrilled about where I am right now. He's with a big firm in Panama City, which was about 8 lawyers. Okay. So he's the person that he worked with before, St. Dennis is his last name. He said, you know what, I'll start an office there and you can be head of the office. So he's now a partner and doing quite well. And he's got offices that he oversees in Tampa and in Miami, as well as in Panama City. So he's the oldest and he is 43 this year, I think. I have a daughter, Nikki, who's here in town. He has 3 children, 2 girls, Al and Sam, and a boy named after me, who she gave birth to, by the way, in the middle of the fireman's trial.
Oh, wow.
And my daughter had arranged with the bailiff that the bailiff would give me the weight and the name on either a blue or a pink piece of paper in the time of, so I'm in the middle of cross-examining a police officer and I sit down and the bailiff hands me a note that says, you're a grandfather again. And this is it. Nikki's a pharmaceutical rep and she lives here in town. My youngest son is Zachary, and Nikki's a University of Toledo project graduate. Zach went to school at Marquette University in Milwaukee, and then came back here for med school. He did his residency in part here in Toledo. He finished at Harvard in Boston, and he is an interventional radiologist, and he came back to work in Toledo, and he's been back almost 11 months now. And he has two little kids, a soon-to-be 3-year-old and a 9-month-old baby. And they're here in town, which is nice. I like it when they're here. So I've got 7 grandkids. I don't see the ones in Florida as often as I'd like, but they're all doing well,
Pete, thank you very much for being with us today. Like I said, you're the best liked attorney I know, and you're a treasure to the entire legal community. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for those kind words. It's been fun. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Boyk Brief. Tune in next time for more stories of law and life.